Hey all, I'm John Avalon with Reality Check on the Extremist Beat. So, why do sociopaths succeed? You know what I'm talking about. Because we see it too often in politics, in business, in society overall. I believe the world is basically full of good people. But there's no denying that sometimes the worst people seem to get ahead with charming duplicity and bullying behavior. And they hold on to power by wielding the old weapons of fear and greed that can affect a lot of folks. So why does this happen? After all, humanity tends to celebrate the opposite values in our stories and faith-based traditions, valuing truth over lies, kindness over callousness, and good over evil. And yet, there's no denying that corrupt leaders attract devoted followers, despite their often incompetent and unethical behavior. So, why do so many people fall under their sway? Is it hardwired into human nature? Or is it about the systems we put in place? That's the subject of a fascinating new book by University College London professor and Washington Post columnist Brian Klaas called Corruptible. Now, you know the problem. You've probably dealt with it in your own life. So I want to dig into the conversation right away to give you some solutions and perhaps some hope that together we can overcome the corrupt leaders we confront in our own lives. Brian, welcome to Reality Check. Let's start off with this. What's the dark triad?
The dark triad is a particularly dangerous cocktail of personality traits that destructive individuals have, including Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy, being a psychopath. And all of us have a little bit of these traits in small doses, but the people who have the dark triad in spades have all of them dialed up, and they can't really turn them down very effectively. And so these people are particularly drawn to power, particularly good at getting it, and extremely destructive when they wield it.
So what about these qualities, which are so loathsome individually, let alone comparatively when they're combined? How do they help people seem to disproportionately succeed? And what can we do to screen them out of powerful positions more effectively?
Well, the first thing is that we have a system in which people self-select into power. In other words, people say, I should be powerful, I should run for office, I should be promoted. And that means that power-hungry people, by definition, go towards those jobs, those positions, and those elections. So already we have a self-selection problem of powerful people who are power-hungry. Then on top of that, we have the fact that Machiavellian narcissistic psychopaths are really good at manipulating other people. When I talk to people who study psychopaths, for example, the two words that come up in every conversation are superficial charm. These people are really good at getting people to like them in short periods of time. And that's exactly what is required if you want to get a job, if you want to get promoted, or, dare I say, if you want to win an election, because they're performances. They're not about the actual qualities the individual has. They're about the ways that you perceive the individual in these short assessments that we use as shortcuts to determine who ends up in power.
So what can we do to screen them out more effectively?
I think we need to start recruiting people who have shown a track record of integrity and moral leadership in our society, rather than waiting for people to put themselves forward for positions of power.
What is it about, though, these dark triad traits that appeal to what you call people's Stone Age brains? Some inner impulse we have that draws people to these narcissistic Machiavellian psychopaths, as you say.
This is one of the most difficult questions because power is relational at the end of the day. You can't be powerful unless you have followers. And so one of the questions I was grappling with is, why do we let these people rule over us when they're so clearly unfit for the job? And the answer perhaps is in this field called evolutionary psychology. And the idea is very simple. It's that our brains haven't had long enough to really change that much over the last 50,000 years or so. So the brains inside of our skulls are basically the same as our hunter-gatherer ancestors from the Stone Age. Now, back in those periods, it may have been adaptive. In other words, it may have helped you survive to gravitate towards someone who was an overconfident, physically large man, for example. If you're facing an invasion from a rival band, or you have some threat of other conflict or crisis, those large figures back in that era might have actually helped you survive. Now, our brains haven't changed. And yet our societies have radically transformed to the fact that we're much more enlightened in how we determine who gets to the top of society in the modern era. But studies in psychology have shown that when you ask people to choose a leader and you prime them by saying, imagine it's a war, it's a famine, it's a crisis, it's a pandemic. In those instances, the psychology literature shows that people gravitate towards taller men, bigger men. And that is why we have this term strongman, because overconfident, imposing men, including Vladimir Putin, who loves to pose shirtless to show this off, have activated this template that's in our brains for why we gravitate towards certain leaders. And so it's not just about the leaders themselves, it's also about us and why we choose people for often quite irrational reasons.
Now, you are very careful not to mention the word Trump in this book, in contrast to your columns in the Washington Post. But let's go there, because we've seen Trump continue his hold on the GOP, despite losing the popular vote twice, being the only president never to reach 50% job approval in office, being the only president impeached twice. And that's not even counting his attempt to overturn an election, which is a corrupt assault on democracy itself. So given your work in this book, how and why do you think he's held on to power within the GOP? And arguably more importantly, what do you think can be done to break this fear-fueled grip he's got?
It's a great question, and it's one that I've seen dynamics like this in other dysfunctional organizations for which the figurehead has become the organization. And I think that's happened to the modern Republican Party, that Trump has, to a huge extent, become the glue that holds together modern Republicans. Now, the problem is that people have to have an off-ramp from their beliefs. So in other words, if you have a Republican who has gone along with lots of Trump's behavior for the last 5 or 6 years, hitting that breaking point creates what psychologists would call cognitive dissonance in them. In other words, they would have to admit that they were wrong for the last several years, and their identity, which is now tied up so closely with being a Trump-supporting Republican, has also been wrong. And that's really, really difficult to do. So I think, one of the problems that we face is that facts just aren't enough anymore. I mean, as we know, you can tell people that the election was not stolen, and it will only make them believe more that it was because it's coming from a source that they think is evil or wrong. And so, my worry about this is that Trump's grip on the GOP is changing the dynamics of the next generation of Republicans. I think that's what we really need to think about and be careful to understand. Because when I said rotten systems attract rotten people, what I mean by that is if somebody is thinking about running for office in their local constituency and they're a lifelong Republican and they look at the Trumpian GOP, they're going to think, the only way I can get elected right now is to lie to people and tell them that Trump should have won the election because it was stolen, even though it wasn't. Now, the people who have no problem with that, the people who are willing to be chameleon-like and to totally change themselves and lie on his behalf, they have a future in the GOP. Everybody else will just self-select out. They'll say, I'm going to lose. Why would I bother? And so what really worries me is that by warping the dynamics in the modern Republican Party, he set up a pipeline for the future generation of Republican leaders that will be more Trump-like. Because again, rotten systems attract rotten people. The Trumpian GOP is going to attract lots of Trumpian-style figures. And unfortunately, that creates a generational problem rather than one that can be resolved in the next 2 to 4 years.
Well, that's sobering, but it also unfortunately makes sense. So let me challenge you to apply some of the practical lessons to the problem of this cult of personality that's taken over a political party. What actions would you recommend that good and honest and decent Republicans take to try to break this fever within their party?
Well, I think there's a few things that can be done. The first is the truth still matters, right? Even if it doesn't always work on people who are true believers, there's a lot of people in the country who have the view that, Trump was okay, but they don't like some aspects of him. Those people are persuadable. So I think there has to be a fight to reclaim the Republican Party from the Trump-style authoritarianism that has taken over in the last several years. But I also think, even though on a system-wide level, it's less likely that good, decent, normal people will self-select into positions of power in the current moment, good, decent, normal people can still do that.
Fascinating stuff. Brian, thank you for writing the book, and thanks for joining us on Reality Check. Be well.